My name is Deller Harmon. I am 34 years old. And 26 years ago, on a Wednesday morning in August, my grandmother drove me to a children's home in rural Tennessee in a car that smelled like menthol cigarettes and old leather, and she set my bag on the porch steps and said, "They'll look after you proper here," and she drove away without looking back. I was 8 years old. I stood on those steps for a long time. Long enough for a woman named Miss Porlett to come out and take my hand and lead me inside. Long enough for the sound of my grandmother's engine to disappear completely into the Tennessee hills. Long enough to understand that nobody was coming back. Nobody did come back. Not that week. Not that year. Not for 26 years. I aged out of the system at 18 with a garbage bag of clothes, a check for $400, and a talent I had found in someone else's kitchen that nobody had given me and nobody could take away. I built something with that talent. Slowly, on borrowed money and 5 a.m. mornings and the particular stubbornness of a person who has nothing to lose and everything to prove. I put my name on the sign above the door. I made it real. And then, when the local paper ran a feature and the bakery's Instagram hit 40,000 followers, and a food magazine in Nashville called us one of the best small bakeries in the state, then the calls started coming. My grandmother first. Then my aunt. Then my 2 cousins who had grown up in the house I had been removed from. Then my uncle, who I had not spoken to since I was 7 years old. 38 calls in 9 days. 26 years of silence. Then 38 calls in 9 days. So I invited them to the grand opening of my second location. I gave them the best table. I handed a microphone to a woman who had spent 34 years building the courage to use one. What I said that morning changed things permanently for every person in that room. But to understand why, you need to understand where I came from. And to understand that, I need to take you back to a yellow house on Calder Road in Fayetteville, Tennessee, in the summer of 1999. The yellow house on Calder Road was my grandmother's house. It had always been my grandmother's house. My mother had grown up there, and when my mother had me at 19 and then left, the way she left everything, without announcement, without explanation, simply one morning no longer present, I ended up there too. My grandmother's name was Vera Harmon. She was a large woman in the way that some Southern women are large, not just in body but in presence, filling whatever room she entered with her voice and her opinions and the particular certainty of someone who has never once questioned whether they were the most important person in any given situation. She had raised 4 children in that yellow house. My mother was the youngest and the most difficult, which Vera mentioned regularly and without apparent awareness that I was the direct consequence of my mother's existence. She had a garden she was proud of and a church she attended twice a week and a circle of women friends with whom she drank sweet tea on the porch on Thursday afternoons and discussed, in considerable detail, the failures of people who were not present. I was, in the accounting of Vera Harmon's life, an inconvenience that had arrived without warning and stayed longer than anticipated. She was not cruel to me in any way she would have recognized as cruelty. She fed me. She kept me clothed. She sent me to school. She fulfilled, by her own measure, the obligations of a grandmother who had not asked for this situation. What she did not do was love me in any way I could feel. She loved my cousins Marcus and Shelby, who lived with their parents in a house 3 streets over and came for Sunday dinner every week. She ruffled their hair. She kept photographs of them on the mantelpiece. She remembered their birthdays without being reminded and made them each a specific cake. Marcus's was chocolate with buttercream. Shelby's was lemon with the sugar crust on top that I used to watch her make from the kitchen doorway, wanting to be asked to help and never being asked. I was in the house but not of the house. That is the best way I know to say it. I was there the way a piece of furniture is there, present, functional, easy to overlook. My Aunt Cecile, who was the middle of Vera's for children and lived 40 minutes away in Colombia, visited on occasional weekends. She was the one adult in my life who sometimes paused to look at me directly and ask how I was managing. She brought me books from the library sales, paperbacks with bent spines and previous owners' names written inside the covers. I read every one of them twice. It was Cecile who told me, years later, that the decision to send me to the children's home had been made at a family meeting I was not present for, in my grandmother's living room, on a Sunday evening in July. The family had decided that Vera was too old to manage a child alone, that my mother was not coming back, that a proper placement was the responsible thing. Nobody had asked me what I thought. Nobody had told me in advance. They had decided, and then my grandmother had driven me there on a Wednesday morning, and that was that. For a long time I was angry at Cecile for not stopping it. Later I understood that Cecile had been the only one in the room who had argued against it, and she had been overruled 4-1, and she had spent the following 2 decades carrying that. But I did not know any of that when I was 8 years old standing on those porch steps. I just knew that the engine sound had gone and that I was alone. The children's home was called Ridgecroft. It sat on a hill outside Fayetteville, a large old farmhouse that had been converted and expanded over the decades until it had lost whatever original character it might have had and become simply institutional. Babe walls. Fluorescent lighting. A gymnasium that doubled as a dining room. A yard with a basketball hoop and a climbing frame, and a stretch of grass that got muddier every October until it was just mud by November. It was not a cruel place. I want to say that clearly because cruelty would have been easier to process. The staff were tired, mostly, the specific tiredness of people who are doing important work with inadequate resources and have been doing it for long enough that they have stopped being able to feel all of it. They were not unkind. They were just stretched thin over too many children and too little support. There were 14 children at Ridgecroft when I arrived. By Christmas there were 17. The population shifted constantly, children coming in, children leaving for placements, children coming back. Arrivals and departures were the rhythm of the place. You learned quickly not to get too attached to the person in the next bed. I learned everything quickly at Ridgecroft. That is what that kind of place does to you. It accelerates certain kinds of learning. The learning of how to read a room. How to be unobtrusive when being visible was risky. How to ask for things in exactly the right way so that the asking did not feel like demand. How to manage your own feelings somewhere private so that the managing did not attract attention. I also learned, in the kitchen, something entirely different. The cook at Ridgecroft was a woman named Miss Odette Washington. She was 53 when I arrived, a compact, brisk woman from Murfreesboro who had worked in restaurant kitchens for 20 years before a back injury had taken her out of that world and deposited her, via a circuitous route involving a cousin and a phone call, into the kitchen at Ridgecroft. She was, by any measure, overqualified for the work she was doing. She knew it and did not complain about it. She simply applied the same standards she had applied in every professional kitchen she had ever worked in: precision, economy, the absolute refusal to send anything out that was not as good as she could make it within the constraints she had been given. The constraints at Ridgecroft were considerable. A budget that required creative arithmetic. Institutional equipment that was older than most of the children. The logistical challenge of feeding 17 people 3 times a day with preferences and allergies, and the general unpredictability of children who had been through things. She managed it with the calm efficiency of a woman who had cooked through a restaurant fire in 1989 and considered everything since then relatively manageable. I found her kitchen by the same instinct that seems to draw certain people toward kitchens: the warmth of it, the purposefulness of it, the fact that a kitchen always has an answer to the question of what to do with your hands. It was a Saturday in October. I had been at Ridgecroft for 2 months. I had been waking early, before the 6:30 bell, from the habit of anxiety that makes sleep feel dangerous. I had been lying in the dark listening to the breathing of the other girls in the room and waiting for a morning that was not different from any other morning and never would be. That Saturday I got up at 5 and walked the corridors in my socks and followed the smell of coffee and something sweet, cinnamon, I thought, and something richer underneath, to the kitchen door. Miss Odette was making biscuits. Not making them in the sense of assembling pre-made dough from a refrigerated tube. Making them from scratch, flour measured by feel into a large ceramic bowl, cold butter cut in with a pastry blender. The mixture worked quickly, minimally, with a particular efficiency of someone who knows that overworking biscuit dough is the only real way to go wrong with it. She looked up when I appeared in the doorway. She did not startle. I would learn later that Miss Odette did not startle easily. She said, "A kitchen's not open till 6. I said, I know. I'm sorry." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "You want to make yourself useful or you want to go back to bed?" I said, "Useful." She handed me a butter wrapper and told me to grease the pan. That was the beginning. I showed up every morning after that. Not just Saturdays, every morning. For 55, kitchen door, hands washed by the time Miss Odette looked up from whatever she was starting. She did not tell me to stop coming. She did not formally invite me either. She simply began, over the course of the following weeks, to include me in what she was doing. She taught me how to make biscuits that rose properly by not overworking the dough. She taught me how to make gravy without lumps. She taught me how to make cornbread in a cast iron skillet that had been seasoned for years and must never, she was very clear about this, be washed with soap. She taught me to taste as I went. To adjust. To understand that a recipe was not a lore but a framework, and that the skill was knowing when and how to deviate from it. She said once, without stopping what she was doing, without preamble or apparent context, the kitchen doesn't care about your circumstances. It cares about whether you pay attention. I wrote that down that evening in a composition notebook I had found in the supply closet. The notebook became the thing I carried everywhere. Every recipe Miss Odette taught me, written out in my careful child's handwriting with notes in the margins about what she said while she was teaching it. On my 9th birthday, which I knew was my birthday and nobody else at Ridgecroft did, because my paperwork had arrived without a copy of my birth certificate and nobody had followed up, Miss Odette made a small chocolate cake. She set it on the prep counter after dinner service when the kitchen was otherwise empty and lit a single candle from the emergency supply drawer and said, "I make a wish." I did not ask how she knew. I made the wish. It was not for my grandmother to come back. I had stopped making that wish by then. It was, if I am honest about it now, for a kitchen of my own someday. The wish took 22 years to arrive. But it arrived. The years between 8 and 18 were the years the system gave me. 3 placements. 2 that ended because the families moved or changed circumstances. 1 that lasted for years with a woman named Mrs. Parrish who was a decent person doing her best with a state stipend that did not cover what it cost and a heart that was genuine if not quite large enough for everything the situation required. I paid attention to what this space wanted to be. It wanted to be a bakery. I had $4,000 in savings and a friend from the diner days named Theo Bassett who was a contractor and who owed me a favor from a complicated situation involving a deposit and a landlord in 2019 that I will not elaborate on except to say that Theo was happy to call us even. I also had, unexpectedly, an ally. Her name was Marguerite Pell. She was 68 years old, originally from New Orleans, a retired pastry chef who had worked in some of the best hotel kitchens in Nashville for 40 years and now ran, in her retirement, a small mentoring program for young people in the food industry who had come up through difficult circumstances. She had heard about me through Bridget. She came into the diner one Wednesday morning, white linen shirt, silver jewelry, reading glasses on a cord, the particular ease of a woman who has been competent for so long that competence has become invisible to her, and sat at the counter and ordered coffee and a biscuit and said without preamble, Bridget says you're wasting yourself here. I said, I'm learning here. She said, you've learned what there is to learn here. What's next? She came back the following Wednesday. And the one after that. Over the next 3 months, she taught me everything Miss Odette and Bridget hadn't: food costing, supplier negotiation, commercial lease structures, the specific arithmetic of a bakery business that looks profitable and isn't because of one overlooked expense category. She was not kind in the soft sense. She was rigorous. She corrected without apology. She praised rarely and specifically, which meant that when she did praise something, it landed with the full weight of something earned. In January of my 24th year, she sat across from me at her kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and a legal pad and said, Are you ready to do this? I said, I don't have enough capital. She said, I know. I'm going to lend you $12,000 at 0 interest. You pay me back when you can. If you can't, I'll consider it the best investment I ever made. She slid the legal pad across. A simple loan agreement, handwritten, 2 clauses. I signed it that evening. I cried after she left. Not because of the money. $12,000 was not, in the scope of what the business needed, a large sum. But because of the specificity of the faith it represented. Someone who had looked at me carefully and decided I was worth betting on. I opened Harmon's Bakehouse 11 months later. Early mornings. Everything from scratch. Biscuits and cornbread and sourdough loaves and the cinnamon rolls that became the reason people drove from Brentwood and Franklin and sometimes farther to stand in line on Saturday mornings. We had 8 tables, a counter, a chalkboard menu, and a used commercial oven that Theo had sourced from a restaurant liquidation in Murfreesboro and driven to Nashville in his pickup at 6 in the morning because he believed in the project and because I had brought breakfast for his crew every day for 2 weeks during the renovation. The first year was the year I learned what survival looks like when it is business-shaped. The second year was the year the regulars started becoming community. The people who came not just for the food but for the specific atmosphere of a place that was built by someone who meant it. The third year was the year Nashville magazine ran a feature that described the cinnamon rolls as the best reason to get up early in East Nashville, and the Instagram following went from 3,000 to 18,000 in a fortnight, and the line on Saturday mornings started before we opened the door. By my 4th year, Theo had come on as my business partner and operations manager. Marguerite had been paid back in full. She had cried when I handed her the check, which surprised me, and then she had put it in her desk drawer and said she was going to frame it, which surprised me more, and then she hugged me and said, now go do the next thing." The next thing was a second location. I found the space the following spring, a corner building in a neighborhood on the other side of town, more visible, higher foot traffic, enough square footage for a full cafe setup and a proper events space. The lease was significantly more expensive. The renovation was more complex. The business case took 6 months to build properly. We signed the lease in February. Construction started in March. The grand opening was scheduled for the first Saturday in June. And in April, the Nashville Food magazine published a profile of me and the bakery. The article mentioned, in the 4th paragraph, that I had grown up in the foster care system in Tennessee. 3 days after the article ran, my grandmother called. I want to be precise about the moment I saw her name on my phone. I was in the new space on a Thursday afternoon, going over tile samples with a contractor, when my phone buzzed on the windowsill. I picked it up without thinking. I looked at the screen. The name was stored in my phone from years earlier. I had kept it there not as an invitation but as a warning. The way you keep something dangerous visible so you do not forget it is dangerous. Vera Harmon. I set the phone face down. I counted to 10. The contractor said something about grout color. I said, "The lighter one." "Sorry, give me a moment." I stepped outside onto the pavement. The April afternoon was warm and smelled of something blooming from a tree I could not identify. I picked the phone back up. I looked at the missed call notification. Then I looked at my messages. There were 3 texts, sent in the hour before the call. The first said, "Deller sweetheart, I saw the article. So proud of you. Call when you can." The second, sent 40 minutes later, "Honey, I've been thinking about you. Would love to reconnect." The third, sent 10 minutes before the call, "I think it's time we talked as a family. God has been putting it on my heart." I read them 3 times. Sweetheart. Honey. Family. 26 years of silence. Then sweetheart, honey, family, God has been putting it on my heart. I forwarded all 3 to Theo with one word, starting. He replied in 30 seconds, "On it. Don't respond yet." I went back inside and chose the lighter grout. Over the following 9 days, 38 calls arrived from 4 different numbers. Vera called 11 times. My Aunt Cecile called twice. I noticed this and noted the difference. 2 calls from Cecile, 11 from Vera. That told me something. My cousin Marcus called 9 times and texted 8 more, a stream of messages that escalated from casual to urgent to something that was almost threatening in its desperation. My cousin Shelby called 6 times and sent a voice message that I listened to once. She was crying, which would have moved me more if I had not spent 34 years building the specific resilience of a person who has learned to distinguish between genuine distress and performed distress. My Uncle Raymond, who I had met perhaps 4 times before the age of 8 and had not seen since, called twice and left a voicemail that said, "Deller, it's your Uncle Raymond. Your grandmother would really like to see you. She's not as young as she used to be. I think it's time." I wrote down the time and date of every call. I saved every text. I compiled them into a folder on my phone that I labeled, with a nomenclature that had become a habit from years of navigating systems that required documentation, for the record. I said, "She isn't part of what I built." Cecile said, "I know that. I'm not sure she does." I said, "I'm inviting them to the grand opening. I want you to know that in advance, and I want you to know why." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Are you going to say something?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Are you going to be all right?" I said, "I'm already all right. I have been all right for a long time. That is rather the point." She said, "I'll be there." She was the only one I called back personally. The rest I addressed through an invitation, sent through the bakery's official email, to the grand opening of Harmon's Bakehouse second location, first Saturday in June, 10 a.m. Before I tell you what happened at that opening, if this story is reaching you, please like and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you are watching from and what time it is. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to the week before the opening, and the thing I found that changed everything. It was a Thursday evening 6 days before the opening. The new location was almost ready, the last of the furniture had arrived, the espresso machine had been installed and tested, the chalkboard menus had been written in Theo's handwriting because his was better than mine. I was alone in the space after the crew had left. Something I did deliberately, sometimes, stayed in a new space in the quiet, getting a sense of it before it became busy and public. I was sitting at one of the window tables with a cup of coffee when my phone buzzed. Cecile. She had sent a photograph. The photograph was of a document. A handwritten letter on lined paper, the kind pulled from a legal pad. The ink was blue. The handwriting was my grandmother's. I recognized it from the occasional birthday card that had arrived at Ridgecroft for the first 3 years before they stopped arriving. The letter was dated August 2001, 2 months after I had been left at Ridgecroft. It was addressed to the County Social Services Office. I enlarged the photograph. The letter was 6 paragraphs long. I will not quote it in full because some of it does not need to be made larger than it already became inside me when I read it. But the substance of it was this. The final paragraph contained a sentence that I read 3 times in the blue light of my phone in the empty new bakery. The child would be better served by a permanent placement elsewhere. I would ask that the county not contact me further on this matter unless absolutely necessary. The child. Not Deller. Not my granddaughter. The child. I sat very still for a long time. The espresso machine hummed. The street outside was quiet. A car passed. The overhead light I had left on in the kitchen threw a warm rectangle across the new hardwood floor. I had known, at some level, that the family had decided not to come back. I had built a life around that knowledge. On top of it, through it. But knowing a thing and seeing it written in someone's own hand in blue ink on official correspondence are not the same experience. I texted Cecile, "Where did you find this?" She replied, "Grandmother's house." She asked me to help sort some boxes. I found it in a folder marked miscellaneous. I texted, "Did she know you were sending it to me?" A long pause. Then, "No. But I'm not sorry." I put my phone in my pocket. I stood up. I walked the length of the new bakery, from the front windows to the back kitchen, a space I had designed with a particular intentionality of someone who has thought about what they want a kitchen to feel like for a long time. The kitchen smelled of new equipment and the ghost of the morning's test baking. Cinnamon and butter and that particular warm undertone that accumulates in baking spaces over time and never fully leaves. I stood at the prep counter. I put both hands flat on the stainless steel. I thought about Miss Odette saying the kitchen doesn't care about your circumstances. I thought about the 8-year-old standing on the porch steps at Ridgecroft. I thought about the composition notebook in the first kitchen, the careful handwriting, the recipe for biscuits in the margin with a note that said, "Cold butter. Always cold butter." She says this twice. I was 34 years old. I had built 2 locations of a business from nothing. I had paid back every debt. I had employed 11 people. I had put my name on the sign. I stood in my kitchen in the quiet, and I decided what I was going to say in 6 days. The morning of the opening I arrived at 4:15. This was my usual time. Bread does not wait for grand occasions and neither do I. I turned on the ovens. I started the sourdough. I set the cinnamon rolls to proof. I made coffee in the old stainless press I had used since the first location because I was suspicious of the new espresso machine, and the old press had never let me down. By 7 Theo arrived. Then my bakers, Jonah, who had been with me since the 2nd year and moved fast and made no unnecessary gestures, Priya, who had trained under a pastry chef in Asheville and come to Nashville looking for a kitchen that was serious without being unkind, and a young woman named Kezia who was 22 and reminded me of myself at 18 in the specific way of someone who works twice as hard as everyone else because she cannot yet believe she deserves to be there. I had told Kezia when I hired her, "You belong in this kitchen. I need you to know that going in." She had looked at me for a moment and then looked at the floor and then back up. She had said, okay. She had been there every morning since. Marguerite arrived at 8:30 with a bottle of champagne she said was for after and flowers from her garden. She sat at the corner table that I had privately designated as her table, the one with the best light and the clearest view of the room, and she read a book she had brought in her bag and occasionally looked up to assess the preparations with the calm authority of a woman who has run events in professional kitchens and knows exactly how much chaos is normal. Miss Odette arrived at 9. I had not expected her. I had invited her. I had sent an invitation to the address she had given me when we reconnected 3 years earlier, after I found her through a network of people connected to Ridgecroft who still stayed in touch. But she lived 2.5 hours away. She had a bad hip. I had not expected her to come. She came through the front door at 9 o'clock with a wooden cane and a dignity that made the cane look like a style choice. 69 years old, white hair cut close, the same broad shoulders, the same brisk energy now operating at a slightly reduced pace. She looked around the bakery. She looked at me. She said, "You built all this?" I said, "I started with your biscuit recipe." She said, "No. You started with you." I had to look at the ceiling for a moment. She sat down at the table next to Marguerite's, which meant that the two women who had built the foundation of everything I knew were sitting 12 feet apart on the morning of the opening. I introduced them. They shook hands with the mutual assessment of two professionals who recognize quality in each other. Theo handed me a coffee. He looked at the two women. He looked at me. He said, quietly, "Are you all right?" I said, "He asked me at noon." He nodded. He went back to the operations he had been managing with the calm efficiency that was his particular talent. At 9:45 they arrived. Vera first. My grandmother was 81 years old now and walked with a cane of her own and wore a blue dress that had been pressed carefully and a brooch at the collar that I recognized from her church photographs on Facebook. She entered the bakery with the particular quality of a woman accustomed to being the most significant person in any room she entered, which she had been for most of her life and was not today. My Aunt Gloria and Uncle Raymond were behind her. Then Marcus, who was 37 now and wore a jacket that suggested he had wanted to make an impression. Then Shelby, who looked at me with the expression of someone managing several feelings simultaneously and succeeding at none of them. Cecile came last. She caught my eye from the doorway and nodded once. Not warmly, not with the particular warmth of conspiracy, but with the steady acknowledgement of someone who has done what they said they would do and trusts what comes next. I had reserved 2 tables at the front, the best placement in the room, exactly as I had said I would. They Saturday. Vera arranged herself in the chair with the particular authority of someone who was accustomed to tables being arranged around her rather than the other way around. She looked around the bakery with the expression I remembered from my childhood. The appraising look. The look that was always counting something. She caught my eye. She smiled. It was a warm smile. That was what was so difficult about Vera. The smile was always warm. The warmth was real. The warmth had simply never been enough. The room filled. 80, then 90 people. Regular customers who had driven from the first location and looked around the new space with the proprietary satisfaction of people who had been there since the beginning. Local journalists. The food writers who had been following the bakery for 2 years. Community figures. The staff from the first location who had driven across town on their day off because they wanted to be in the room. Pastor Elaine from the church I occasionally attended on Sunday mornings when I needed somewhere to sit that was larger than my own thoughts. The 3 women I had been running a monthly baking class for at the community centre, all 3 of them former foster care youth, all 3 of them learning what I had learned from Miss Odette, that the kitchen would give you something certain when everything else was uncertain. At 10:15 Theo handed me the microphone. It was a plain handheld, slightly warm from the lights. Theo had tested it twice that morning. I stepped up onto the small raised platform we had built beside the counter, not a stage, just a place to stand where people could see you. I said, thank you for being here. The room went quiet. The particular quiet of people who have been waiting. I started where I had planned to start. The bakery. The beginning. The first location, the early mornings, the broken oven in the first winter that I had fixed by watching YouTube tutorials for 4 hours and then calling Theo at midnight. The room was smiling. Then I turned. I said, I want to thank some people who made this possible. I thanked Theo first. He raised a hand from his position near the kitchen door. The room applauded. I thanked Marguerite. She stood, briefly, and waved her hand with the characteristic dismissiveness of someone who finds being thanked publicly uncomfortable. She sat back down. Miss Odette, seated beside her, patted her arm once. I thanked Miss Odette. I said her name and she lifted her coffee cup from the table and the room applauded, and she nodded once in the way of a woman who accepts recognition as a fact rather than a compliment. I thanked Jonah and Priya and Kezia by name. I thanked the regulars who had been there from the first week. I thanked Bridget, who was not present but whose phone I knew was going to receive a recording of this within the hour from 3 different people who had been at her diner with her. Then I paused. I let the warmth in the room settle. Then I said, as some of you know that my family is here today. I gestured toward the front tables. Vera straightened. Her smile became more deliberate. I said, I want to talk about them. About what my family gave me and what they did not give me, and about the difference between those two things. The smile on Vera's face held for 3 seconds before something began to shift behind it. I said, 26 years ago, when I was 8 years old, my grandmother drove me to a children's home called Ridgecroft in Fayetteville, Tennessee, and left me there. My mother had already left. The family had a meeting I was not present for and decided that a placement was the responsible choice. I was not told in advance. I was not given a choice. I was placed in the back seat of my grandmother's car on a Wednesday morning, and I watched her drive away from the front steps of that building. The room was completely silent. From the front table I heard a sound. Small, controlled. My Aunt Gloria had put her hand over her mouth. Marcus was looking at the table. Cecile was looking at me. Vera was very still. I said, I spent 10 years in the foster care system. 3 placements. I aged out at 18 with $400 and a garbage bag of clothes and something no one had given me but someone had helped me find. The knowledge that a kitchen is a place where your circumstances do not matter as much as your attention. I held up the composition notebook. The one from Ridgecroft, from Miss Odette's kitchen. The cover soft and dark with years. I said, this notebook was given to me by a woman named Miss Odette Washington, who ran the kitchen at Ridgecroft Children's Home, and who taught me what I know about baking. Every recipe I have ever made started here. The room looked at the notebook. I said, 26 years later, when this bakery was written about in a magazine, my family called. 38 times in 9 days. Sweetheart and honey and would love to reconnect. Vera's hands were folded on the table. The folding had become very precise. I said, I have a document. A letter my grandmother wrote to the County Social Services Office 2 months after I was placed at Ridgecroft, formally requesting that the county cease efforts to reunify me with the family. From my apron pocket, I took a single folded sheet. Theo had printed it that morning, clear and sharp on white paper. I said, I am not going to read the whole letter. I'm going to read 1 sentence. I looked at the page. I looked up. I said, the child would be better served by a permanent placement elsewhere. Silence. The particular silence of 90 people not breathing. Vera said, quietly, Deller, that was a long time ago and the circumstances. I said, a grandma. She stopped. I said, I am not angry. I need you to understand that. This is not anger. Anger would have been easier. What I am is clear. And what I am clear about is this: you did not lose me to circumstances. You gave me up because keeping me would have been inconvenient. And then, when what I built became something, you called 38 times in 9 days. The muscle in Vera's jaw worked. She said, I came because I love you. I said, I know you believe that. And I believe there is something in you that has always been genuine. But love that writes that letter and then drives away is not the kind of love that gets to stand in front of this room and take credit for what I built. She stood. She was 81 years old and she stood like a woman of 40, which told me something about the depth of the feeling. She said, I won't be spoken to like this. Not in public. Not by you. I said, you've been speaking about me in public for 26 years. To people who asked where I was. To people who asked how many grandchildren you had. You've been speaking for me without my presence for my entire life. I'm speaking for myself today. In my bakery. That I built. With the people who actually showed up. She picked up her handbag. Raymond stood. Gloria stayed seated, her hand still over her mouth. Marcus looked up. He was crying. Quietly, with the specific stillness of a man who does not cry often and is surprised to find himself doing it. Vera walked to the door. Her cane clicked on the new hardwood with the sharp regularity of something deliberate. Raymond followed. The door opened. The door closed. From the back of the room, Miss Odette's voice. Good hands. 2 words. Exactly as she had said them when I was 9 years old. The room turned toward her. She was sitting with her coffee cup raised slightly, not toasting, just present, just herself, entirely unmoved by drama. Then she looked back at her cup and set it down. Marguerite, 12 feet away, began to clap. Measured, deliberate. The kind of applause that means, I have watched this person become who they are and I am not surprised and I am proud. Theo joined from the kitchen doorway. Then the room. Not a theatrical ovation. Something quieter and more lasting. The sound of a community acknowledging something true. I waited for it to settle. I said, thank you for being here. Everything in the case was made this morning, and it is on the house. Please eat. I stepped down from the platform. My legs carried me. I was grateful to them. Cecile reached me first. She did not hug me. She stood close and looked at me directly and said, she knew what she was doing when she wrote that letter. I want you to know I have never forgotten that. I said, I know. She said, I'm sorry I wasn't louder. I said, you were here today. She nodded. She went to find a chair. Miss Odette was standing when I reached her. She had gotten to her feet slowly and was waiting with the patience of a woman who has been waiting for things her whole life and has made it a practice. She put her hand on my arm. The same wide, flour-dusted hand from 25 years ago. Time had not made it smaller. She said, you did good. I said, I started with your biscuit recipe. She said, you started with you. I told you already. She sat back down and picked up her coffee and looked out the window at the Nashville street outside with the mild satisfaction of a woman who has gone 2.5 hours out of her way and found it entirely worthwhile. The story after the opening is quieter than the opening itself. The best stories usually end that way. The drama peaks and then life resumes at its normal pace, slightly rearranged, the way a room looks after furniture has been moved. Vera did not call again. I had not expected her to. She was a woman who needed to believe she was the protagonist of every situation she was in, and I had declined to give her that role, which meant the situation was no longer one she could occupy comfortably. Raymond sent a text 3 days after the opening that said, "Your grandmother is very hurt." I forwarded it to Theo and did not reply. Marcus texted on the 4th day. He said, "I looked for you, you know. A few years ago. I didn't know what you'd been through. Mom and Grandma told us you were with a family in Savannah. I believed it because I was a kid, and then I never questioned it, because questioning it would have meant asking what we'd done." He paused. I could see the typing indicator. Then, "I'm sorry I didn't ask." I read it twice. I wrote back, "Thank you. That's true and it matters." We have not spoken since, but the message is there, and sometimes true things need to simply exist somewhere before they can become anything else. Shelby sent flowers to the bakery on the Monday after the opening. No note. Just flowers, yellow ones, from a florist I recognized as being near her apartment in Franklin. I put them on the counter by the register. I did not call her. The flowers were something. I was not sure yet what they were the beginning of. Cecile came for coffee 3 weeks later. We sat at the corner table, Marguerite's table. She was not there that day, and we talked for 2 hours. She told me things I had not known, the specific argument she had made at the family meeting in 1999, the decision she had been overruled on, the years she had spent trying to find ways to check on me through channels she hoped Vera would not notice. She told me about the letter, that she had found it by accident and had sat with it for 3 weeks before deciding to send it to me. She said, "I don't expect you to forgive me for not doing more." I said, "I'm not in the business of withholding forgiveness from the people who tried. I'm in the business of being clear about what happened." She said, "What do you want from this?" "From me, I mean. Going forward." I thought about it honestly. I said, "I want to know you. Not as family by obligation. As a person I've chosen to know, who has chosen to know me back. The rest we can figure out." She looked at her coffee. She said, "That sounds like something that might actually work." It was the most honest conversation I had had with a blood relative in my entire life. 6 months after the opening, I drove back to Fayetteville on a Saturday morning. Not to see Vera. I drove past the yellow house on Calder Road. It was the same, smaller than I remembered, the garden less tended than it used to be, and I kept driving. I drove to Ridgecroft. The building is still standing. It closed in 2014, after the county consolidated its children's services. It has been empty since. The grounds are overgrown, Bermuda grass growing through the cracks in the concrete, the basketball hoop rusted and netless, the old playground equipment oxidizing quietly. The kitchen window is visible from the parking lot if you know where to look. I stood at the fence for a while and looked at it. I thought about 5 a.m. I thought about butter cut into flour. I thought about the cast iron skillet and the rule about soap. I thought about a woman who had been overqualified for her job and had done it with complete professionalism anyway, and in the doing of it had handed a 9-year-old child a composition notebook and said, "Write down every recipe you learn." I did not go inside. The building is not mine to enter. I stood at the fence for a while. Then I got in the car and drove back to Nashville. On Monday morning the bakery opened at 6. The sourdough came out of the oven at 6:15, exactly as it always does. The cinnamon rolls were proofed by 5:30 and baked by 6 and in the display case by 6:45. Kezia opened the front doors. The first customer, a man named Gerald who came every Monday without fail and always ordered the same thing, nodded at me from the counter. I nodded back. The day began. Here is what I know, from the particular vantage point of a 34-year-old woman who has been building something since she was 8 years old without knowing that was what she was doing. The family that claims you in success is not the family that raised you. The family that raised you is the one that was there in the difficult years, the ordinary, unglamorous, unremarkable years when there was nothing to gain from showing up except the satisfaction of having shown up. Vera did not raise me. Vera drove me to a building and signed a letter and went home to the yellow house on Calder Road. Miss Odette raised me. Not formally, not legally, not in any category the system recognizes. She raised the part of me that knew what to do with my hands when I did not know what to do with anything else. She raised the part of me that understood that a recipe is a framework, not a lore, and that the skill is knowing when to deviate. Marguerite Pell raised the next part of me. The part that understood how to build a business, how to negotiate, how to see around corners. The part that understood that having good instincts is not enough and that you have to learn the language of the world you are trying to operate in. Theo raised another part. The part that knows what it means to have a partner who shows up before you ask, who drives a van full of kitchen equipment across town at 6 in the morning because he believes in the project, who tells you when you are about to make a mistake and then helps you recover from it anyway when you make it. These people are my family. Not by blood. By choice. By the repeated, daily, ordinary choice to show up. And I am building, now, a version of what they gave me. The baking class at the community centre. The composition notebooks I give to every young person who comes through. The jobs I offer to people coming out of care who need someone to tell them they belong in the kitchen. Every Thursday evening I teach 6 young people how to make biscuits. I tell them cold butter, always cold butter. I tell them the dough does not care where you come from. I tell them the kitchen only cares whether you pay attention. And I tell them, write down every recipe you learn. Someday you will want to remember where you started. I started in someone else's kitchen at 5 in the morning with flour on a borrowed apron. I am still there, in every meaningful sense, every morning. The oven's a mine now. The kitchen is mine. The name above the door is mine. That is enough. That is, in fact, everything. The family that claims you in success is not the family that built you. Know who built you. Thank them by name.